How's it going, everyone? Well, Street Fighter 6 is upon us and we're always speculating about the game. The first teaser really didn't offer much in terms of information, so I decided to join in on the fun and try to predict the game's initial roster. After all, I did get a lot of Samurai Showdown's DLC right, so let's see if I can repeat that performance for the second time. If it wasn't clear already, this won't be a wish list, but my best attempt to predict the roster. Maybe I'll revisit this team later and talk about the characters I want to see instead of who I think will be in the game. We'll see how it goes. So the first thing we need to discuss is roster size, which is actually pretty difficult to guess. I'm sure that if it was up to the fans, the roster would be comparable to Street Fighter Cross Tekken's 38 fighters or maybe Mortal Kombat 11's 25 combatants. But no. In Street Fighter, after a pandemic with a possible big shift in art style the teaser seems to imply, and considering the franchise history, I doubt it. I think 20 would be a nice size, but I don't think I have that much hope for a large starting roster. Street Fighter V had 16, so let's give Capcom a little credit and say they want to at least surpass the previous game, so we'll go with 18 instead. It's more than what I believe is the minimum for a modern Street Fighter, and less than the ideal, so it's right there in the middle. Okay, so with that out of the way, all that remains is to figure out who will be in those spots, and we already know the name of two of those characters, Ryu and Luke, which leaves us with 16 more names to figure out. The timeline is also important, and the trailer does seem to imply we're looking at the future, though probably not too far from the events of Third Strike, so not enough to introduce children or dispose of the original characters. Not that I think Capcom would ever be brave enough to pull this risky maneuver anyway. Then there's Rose's whole speech about returning to Zero in her Street Fighter V character story. Could this possibly mean that the game will take place in two different timelines, featuring at the same time the classic characters a little older, as well as younger versions, or maybe even characters that are already dead in the story, like, say, Gotetsu? It's a possibility, and a fun direction if you ask me, but somehow I don't believe it's the direction they're taking. Let's chuck this one into the wishlist category. One thing that I'm pretty effing sure will happen is the return of fan favorites that missed SF5, like what happened with Mika and Charlie, who were asked for but not present in SF4. With such a small roster, I don't think we can realistically spare more than 4 names for that, but I have a pretty good idea of who those could be. One of them just has to be Fei Long. He's simply too recognizable, even if you don't know anything about Street Fighter and only think of him as a Bruce Lee clone. Besides, he's quite popular in the scene, and was even the only newcomer from Super Street Fighter 2, besides Cammy, to be introduced in Street Fighter 4's launch roster. So mark my words, Fei Long will be back. I can also see him as a Season 1 DLC, since his appeal also makes him a prime candidate for that spot, but I'll go as far as to risk a launch roster nomination. For the second character, I think Crimson Viper has a pretty good chance of making the cut. She brings with her the promise of a more technical character that is complex but rewarding for those who put the time. For some in the community, this is an element that was missing in SF5, so bringing a character that is known for her complexity is probably a good way to earn the trust of some of those players again. Besides, she is also a female character, which always helps. Those DLC costumes aren't going to sell themselves after all. The third returning fighter is probably Q, who might even turn out to be G or at least have some sort of connection with him. I even think one of them, or perhaps both, will be the final boss of this game. Q might not have made much of a splash in the community when he was released back in Third Strike, but G, with whom he shares a lot of similarities, was very well received. Capcom might want to keep the mystery going, but I want to believe the next game will center around them in some form, so we'll probably be seeing more of Q, or G, or both. My fourth pick? Sodom. I know, this is a little less obvious, but hear me out. Like me in my videos, Capcom sometimes likes to throw curveballs to keep things interesting, like when they decided to give MODOK a spot in Marvel vs. Capcom 3. Sometimes these wild cards can even surprise people and become very interesting characters, like Birdie for example, who I'm sure wasn't topping a lot of popularity charts and even less people would expect or want him to be reworked into a chubby fighter. Still, the gameplay mechanics turned out to be interesting and the character even went on to win a Capcom Cup. So yeah, for the wildcard factor, for being absent for a long time, and for the possibility of getting a major redesign, I think Sodom is returning for Street Fighter 6 and he's going to feel like a brand new character. With that out of the way, we only have 12 more characters to choose from, and I'll say at least 2 of them will be returning after showing up for the first time in Street Fighter 5. The first one I strongly believe is Rashid. He's popular in both high level and casual play, has a fun soundtrack, and being a Middle Eastern character, represents a region that is growing in importance. I'm sure this had something to do with Rashid's introduction in the first place, so I bet Capcom will keep him in the roster, especially since he was so well received. The second Street Fighter V character to make the cut is probably going to be a female, but sadly not my fault. I have very little hope of seeing her again anytime soon, so if I'm thinking of a female character to carry the torch of SF5, that's more realistically a job for Laura, Colleen, or Menat. Of those, Menat's design does a lot for her, but she's probably too technical to be a launch character. Colleen's chances would probably be pretty good if Gil or the Illuminati were to have anything to do with the plot, but I doubt that'll be the case. Which leaves us then with Laura, who's both super popular and probably a great way to sell DLC costumes, so I bet Capcom will want to keep her around some more. Moving on, we have 10 more spots and it's time to fill them with some classic characters, which is easier said than done when you have the difficult task of cutting so many popular choices. Let's start with the obvious then. Ken, Chun-Li, Cammy and Guile have to be there. I was honestly super surprised to see Guile as a DLC fighter in 5, and I don't think Capcom is pulling that trick again. And Remy, sorry, but no, I don't see that happening outside a late DLC spot. With those 4 out of the way, we also need some space for brand new characters, and of those remaining 6, I'm giving half of those spots to newcomers. After all, remember, Luke was probably planned for 6 but became a late addition to 5, so he would have been the 4th character to complete the more expected number of 4 newcomers. What kind of characters those Street Fighters will be is impossible to predict, but in the interest of putting myself out there to be proven wrong and trying to guess as much as possible, I would say 2 of them are women and one of these women is from India. As for the last Street Fighters, I don't think Capcom is done with the Shadaloo crew, so M. Bison, Balrog and Vega will probably be returning once again. I personally would like them to explore a different story, but if we're here to make predictions and not requests, I think Capcom will be playing safe. And that's about it for my roster, guys. Let's review it quickly. 18 fighters with 4 returning characters that missed SF5, Fei Long, Crimson Viper, Q and Sodom. Another 4 are new characters, one of those spots being Luke's, even if he's technically not a new character anymore, and 2 fighters that made their debuts in Street Fighter V, Rashid and Laura. The final 8 are legacy fighters, Ryu, Ken, Chun-Li, Cammy, Guile, M. Bison, Balrog and Vega. I doubt I'll get all of these right, but I'm curious to see how close I can get. Let's return here once we know the full roster to check it out. Meanwhile, feel free to post your own predictions below and let me know if you want me to expand this with DLC characters or maybe talk about the ones I want to see in the game. For now, this has been Edukimi Player, and I'll see you guys later.